Go.
Yes, welcome, Mr. Michael. Welcome. Welcome. Now, the next question is how much air needed for forced air heaters, natural gas, and do you calculated it in your climate controllers?
Um, Interesting question. So the question is how much air do the heaters need
Forced air heaters,
themselves?
yes.
Um, we usually don't take it in account in consideration of our ventilation rates because in the most cases, the bird fresh air requirements exceeds that of the birds. I mean, of the heating system. But it's also one of the reasons that we determine our uh, fresh air requirements based on what's happening in the house. Is if we have the right temperature, the right humidity, the right CO2, then we know we're ventilating enough. So it's always important to determine your ventilation rates not off of the number of birds or the number of heaters, but what's actually happening in the house. And so if we have again the proper humidity, the proper CO2, ammonia levels, then we know we're ventilating enough.
That's good. And how much air needed for the birds in all ages separately?
The primary
Minimum
thing that
ventilation.
the primary thing that determines the amount of fresh air the birds require is usually moisture levels. So we try to base our ventilation rates off of house humidity and temperature. It's hard to predict in general how much air the birds need because it's highly variable on local conditions. So I'd almost have to have a more specific question than that. Is everybody wants just, oh, this is how many cubic meters per hour per kilogram you need. It's not that simple.
But
And that
generally,
leads,
we calculated 0.5 cubic meter per hour per kg for the minimum ventilation. But now this question is also mentioned that especially in high altitude, how much air must be added in high altitude?
well, see, I don't believe the zero point 0.5 cubic meters per hour per kilogram. That's a number that Scove likes to throw out there. And that's a very, very rough estimate that can lead to problems because what we need to be ventilating off, not of how many birds or kilograms of birds are in the house, but what the conditions are in the house. That it's it's most important for just to meet the birds' demands, and the birds' demands varies from house to house, altitude to altitude, and things like that. So the zero point 0.5 cubic meters per hour per kilogram is a theoretical number to control moisture. That's all it is for the conditions in Denmark. It's not the conditions in South America. It's not the conditions in England. It's not the conditions in Pakistan. So, again, as long as you understand that's a very rough number that is calculated based off of local conditions to control moisture, it's not a scientific hard number. Now, the ventilation rates at altitude are essentially the same they are down low. It's the if you ventilate more at a high altitude, what will often happen is the house will get too cold. And if it gets
Yes.
too cold, that will do more damage than the lower oxygen level. It's it's not that there's not enough oxygen in the air at altitude. It's the bird's ability to process that oxygen with their respiratory system when growing fast. So if you grew birds slower at altitude, then the altitude is not a problem. But the faster you push growth at high altitude, the more problems you're going to have. So the other thing at altitude is that we don't want our birds getting cold, because cold birds increases their oxygen demand.